The Pacific Ocean doesn't negotiate. On the morning of December 18th, 1944, the United States Third Fleet, 7 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, and roughly 50 destroyers, sailed directly into the center of a Category 5 Super Typhoon. Not around it, not away from it, into it. Within hours, 3 destroyers had capsized and sunk. Nearly 800 sailors were swallowed by waves the height of apartment buildings. More aircraft were destroyed than in some battles. And the architect of this catastrophe? Admiral William Bull Halsey, one of the most celebrated naval commanders of World War II, the man whose face would later grace magazine covers, whose victories had become legend. This wasn't an ambush. There was no enemy fleet lying in wait. The Japanese didn't fire a single shot. Nature simply presented a test, and the United States Navy failed it spectacularly. Here's the part that keeps you awake at night. Halsey had warnings, weather reports, barometric readings dropping like stones, ships rolling at angles that defied physics. And yet, the fleet kept steaming forward, chasing a refueling rendezvous that would cost more lives than many combat operations. Imagine standing on the bridge of a destroyer, watching the sky turn the color of a bruise, feeling the deck pitch beneath your feet, and knowing that someone, somewhere up the chain of command, made a choice that put you here. If you were given fragmentary weather data, conflicting reports, and a mission-critical fuel shortage, would you have ordered the fleet to turn south? Would you have trusted the forecast that promised calmer waters just beyond the horizon? That's the question Halsey faced, and the answer he chose would become one of the most tragic ironies in naval history. The briefing room. History is full of these forgotten lessons. Moments where the hubris of certainty collided with the chaos of reality, where the line between triumph and catastrophe was drawn not by enemy action, but by a cascade of human misjudgments. To ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the archives, join us by subscribing, because the stories buried in these declassified reports, the testimonies of survivors, the weather maps that went unread, they deserve to be remembered, not as punchlines, but as warnings. The illusion of invincibility. Let's rewind 3 days. December 15th, 1944. The war in the Pacific is no longer a question of if the Allies will win, but when. The decisive battle of Leyte Gulf has just concluded 2 months prior, the largest naval battle in history, a crushing defeat for the Japanese fleet. General Douglas MacArthur's forces are island-hopping their way back to the Philippines, and the Imperial Japanese Navy is, for all practical purposes, a shadow of its former self. The kamikazes are desperate. The airfields are burning. Victory smells like salt water and aviation fuel. Task Force 38 is the tip of the spear. Commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, but operating under the overall authority of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. This armada represents the most powerful concentration of naval aviation in human history. 7 Essex-class carriers, each one a floating city of steel, aircraft, and 5,000 men. 6 Independence-class light carriers. Battleships whose guns could level coastal installations from miles offshore. And a screen of destroyers darting between the capital ships like sheepdogs, eyes scanning the horizon for submarines, for aircraft, for threats. For 3 straight days, they've been pounding Japanese positions on Luzon. Wave after wave of Hellcats and Avengers screaming off the flight decks, strafing airfields, sinking merchant ships, turning enemy infrastructure into rubble. The strikes are devastatingly effective. 269 Japanese aircraft destroyed, railroads blasted. The invasion of Mindoro, a smaller island to the south, proceeds almost unopposed because Halsey's carriers have swept the skies clean. The tempo is relentless. Pilots fly multiple sorties per day, returning with gun cameras full of footage showing Japanese positions erupting in flames. Intelligence officers aboard the carriers tally the damage. Factories destroyed, supply depots obliterated, defensive positions turned to craters. The operation is ahead of schedule. MacArthur's invasion forces will face minimal air resistance when they hit the beaches. Everything is proceeding according to plan, but there's a cost to this tempo. A hidden one. The destroyers, those nimble workhorses of the fleet, are running on fumes. Their fuel tanks are smaller than the lumbering battleships and carriers. They've been sprinting at high speed for days, chasing contacts, screening the task force, burning through thousands of gallons of oil. By December 17th, many of them are critically low, so low that their bunkers are nearly empty, making them top-heavy and dangerously unstable in rough seas. Without fuel, they're not just ineffective, they're liabilities. The fuel situation creates a tactical vulnerability that every officer in the fleet understands. A destroyer with empty tanks rides too high in the water, its center of gravity shifted upward, its propeller barely submerged. In calm seas, this is merely inefficient. In rough weather, it becomes lethal. The ship loses stability, becomes susceptible to capsizing, transforms from a warship into a cork bobbing helplessly on the swells. Halsey knows this. Everyone knows this. And so, the decision is made: rendezvous with the fleet oilers 300 miles east of Luzon, far enough from Japanese-held territory to avoid kamikaze attacks, and refuel the entire task force in one coordinated evolution. It's a routine operation. They've done it dozens of times. The logistics are worked out. The coordinates are set. What could possibly go wrong? The man in command, William Frederick Halsey, Jr., is not a man known for hesitation. Nicknamed Bull for his aggressive, no-nonsense leadership style, he's a kind of commander who inspires fierce loyalty and fiercer headlines. He was there at the beginning, commanding the carrier task force that launched the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the first American counterstrike after Pearl Harbor. He fought at Guadalcanal, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His carriers helped annihilate the Japanese fleet. To the American public, he's a hero. To his sailors, he's a fighter. To the Japanese, he's a nightmare. His career has been defined by audacity. When others counsel caution, Halsey attacks. When intelligence suggests withdrawing, he presses forward. This philosophy has served him well. His aggressive tactics at Guadalcanal helped turn the tide in the Solomon Islands. His pursuit of the Japanese carrier force at Leyte Gulf, though controversial for leaving the invasion beaches exposed, ultimately contributed to one of the most decisive naval victories in American history. But Halsey has a reputation for something else, too: impatience with delay. When there's a mission, you execute. When there's an objective, you press forward. Doubt is for staff officers and meteorologists. Combat rewards decisiveness, not caution. In Halsey's worldview, shaped by decades at sea and countless battles, momentum matters more than perfection. A good plan executed aggressively beats a perfect plan executed timidly. And right now, in mid-December 1944, Halsey is under pressure. MacArthur's timetable doesn't allow for weather delays. The airstrikes on Luzon are scheduled to resume on December 19th. The invasion schedule is tight. The fleet must refuel. The mission must continue. So when weather forecasters begin murmuring about a tropical disturbance forming somewhere to the east, a low-pressure system, poorly defined, fragmentary data, the usual chaos of Pacific meteorology, Halsey listens. But he doesn't stop, because in December 1944, weather forecasting in the Pacific is less science and more educated guesswork. There are no satellites, no radar network spanning thousands of miles. Weather stations are scattered across vast, empty ocean. Reports come from ships, from the occasional island outpost, from Army Air Force reconnaissance flights when they can spare the resources. But there are gaps, huge gaps, blind spots where storms can grow, shift, accelerate, and become monsters without anyone knowing until it's too late. The Pacific theater is particularly challenging for meteorologists. Typhoons form with alarming speed in the warm waters east of the Philippines, their development often hidden from observation until they're already mature systems. Unlike the Atlantic, where weather patterns move in relatively predictable paths from Africa across the ocean, Pacific storms can zigzag, stall, accelerate without warning. They're temperamental, unpredictable, and lethal. The forecast that reaches Halsey's flagship, the battleship New Jersey, is frustratingly vague. A storm system, yes, probably moving north. The meteorologists say if the fleet turns south, they'll avoid the worst of it and find calmer waters for refueling. Probably, Halsey orders the fleet south, and unwittingly, He steers 70 ships directly into the path of what will later be classified as a Category 5 Super Typhoon, 160-mile-per-hour winds, waves towering 7 stories high, barometric pressure so low that instruments struggle to register it. The kind of storm that doesn't just damage ships, it devours them. But on the morning of December 17th, as the fleet begins its turn, the skies are merely gray. The wind is picking up, sure. The seas are getting choppy. But nothing the United States Navy can't handle. After all, they've been winning this war for months. What's a little weather? The first whisper. December 17th, 0800 hours. The Third Fleet spreads across 100 square miles of Philippine Sea, gray hulls slicing through water that's beginning to churn with rhythm that doesn't feel right. On the bridge of the destroyer USS Hull, Lieutenant Commander James Marks watches a barometer. It's falling. Not dramatically, not yet, but steadily. The kind of drop that makes veteran sailors glance at each other without saying a word. The sky is the color of old concrete. The wind carries a charge, a pressure against the skin that feels like the ocean itself is holding its breath. Marks has been at sea for 20 years. He's weathered storms before, navigated through tropical depressions, ridden out squalls that turn day into night. But something about this morning feels different. The swells aren't just building. They're organized, rhythmic, arriving from a consistent direction with increasing power. The wind isn't gusting randomly. It's steady, backing around in a circular pattern that suggests rotation. These are the signatures of a cyclonic system. Something big is out there. Down in the fleet oilers, hoses are being rigged for the refueling evolution. These floating gas stations, ungainly, slow, but absolutely critical, are supposed to pump thousands of gallons of fuel oil into the thirsty destroyers, while both ships steam side by side at matching speeds. It's a dance that requires calm seas, steady hands, and perfect coordination. In peacetime, it's routine. In building swells, it's an invitation for disaster. By 0940, the first hoses part. The sound is like a gunshot. Steel couplings snapping under tension. Fuel spraying across decks, sailors scrambling to secure the whipping lines before someone gets killed. The destroyers peel away, their tanks still hovering near empty, their captains radioing back to flagship. Conditions deteriorating, unable to complete refueling. Aboard the oiler Nanahala, deck crews struggle to secure the ruptured hoses. Black oil slicks spread across the water, creating a shimmering rainbow on the gray swells. The oiler captain watches as destroyers pull away and makes a grim calculation. If conditions are already too rough for refueling, they're going to get worse. Much worse. Halsey receives the reports aboard New Jersey. The massive battleship barely notices the swells that are tossing the destroyers like toys. From his vantage point, 30 feet above the waterline, on a ship displacing 45,000 tons, the weather looks manageable. Rough, yes, but manageable. This is the first crack in the plan, the perceptual disconnect between the big ships and the small. On New Jersey, surrounded by armor plate and riding on a hull longer than 2 football fields, the 15-foot swells feel like gentle rocking. But on destroyers displacing 1/20 of the tonnage, those same swells are mountainous, sending the bow plunging into troughs and the stern lifting clear of the water. His aerologist, the naval term for meteorologist, presents the latest forecast, a tropical disturbance, positioned roughly 450 miles to the east. It's moving north, the data suggests. If the fleet adjusts course, steers south and west, they'll skirt the system entirely and find smoother water for refueling. The recommendation is clear. Turn south. Halsey nods. The order goes out across the task force. What nobody knows, what nobody can know with the technology in 1944, is that the storm isn't 450 miles away. It's 120 miles away. And it's not moving north. It's tracking west-northwest, growing tighter and more vicious with every passing hour, winds already screaming past 140 knots. The fleet turns south, directly into the path of annihilation, the disconnect. There's a phenomenon in naval command that's almost impossible to articulate until you've lived it. The gap between the map and the water. On New Jersey, Halsey's staff huddles over charts in the Combat Information Center. Weather plots are marked with grease pencil. Barometric readings from individual ships are radioed in and transcribed onto boards. Winds, pressure gradients, estimated storm centers, all of it synthesized into a picture of what the meteorologists believe is happening across thousands of square miles of ocean. The Combat Information Center is a technological marvel for 1944. Radar screens display contacts. Radio operators monitor dozens of frequencies simultaneously. Plotters update ship positions on large horizontal maps. It's a hive of controlled activity. Every officer focused on their specific task. Every piece of information feeding into the larger tactical picture. But the ocean doesn't care what the map says. 300 miles away, aboard the destroyer USS Spence, Lieutenant Commander James Andrea is living a different reality. His ship displaces just over 2,000 tons. The fuel bunkers are nearly empty, so empty that the ship is riding high in the water, top-heavy, unstable. Every wave that slams into the hull sends a shudder through the frame. The wind is no longer gusting. It's constant now, a howl that drowns out voices, that makes it impossible to hear orders shouted from 10 feet away. Andrea is 34 years old, an academy graduate with 5 years of destroyer command experience. He knows his ship intimately. Every vibration, every groan of stress metal, every quirk of her behavior in heavy seas. And right now, Spence is telling him something his instruments haven't yet confirmed. They're sailing into a major storm system. Andrea orders ready ammunition, moved from the weather decks down into the magazines. Depth charges are defused and secured. Hatches are dog-tight. Emergency lifelines are rigged. He's preparing his ship for heavy weather because he can feel it coming. In the vibration of the deck plates, in the way the horizon has vanished into a gray-green haze, in the wind that's shifting direction with alarming speed. But the orders from the flagship keep coming. Maintain course. Proceed to rendezvous point. Prepare for refueling operations. Andrea obeys. What else can he do? He's a destroyer captain in a fleet of 70 ships. Halsey is an admiral with 3 stars and a combat record that fills textbooks. Surely, the admiral knows something Andrea doesn't. Surely, the meteorologists have information that justifies steaming deeper into this maelstrom. Surely, this is a second crack. The assumption that higher command possesses superior information, that the big picture justifies local discomfort, that individual concern should be subordinated to fleet-level strategy. It's a reasonable assumption in wartime. It's also, in this case, catastrophically wrong. The Cascade. By 15:33 hours on December 17th, even Halsey's staff can no longer ignore the signs. Commander George Kosko, the lead aerologist aboard New Jersey, receives a critical update from Captain Jasper Acuff, commander of the Oiler Group. Acuff's ships are experiencing conditions far worse than predicted. Barometric pressure is plummeting. The seas are building into mountains. Acuff's assessment is unambiguous. A major storm is bearing down on the second rendezvous point. Kosko brings a report to Halsey. The Admiral studies the weather charts, noting the scattered barometric readings from ships across the task force. The pressure gradient is steeper than expected. The wind patterns suggest a cyclonic system. But where exactly is the storm center? The readings are contradictory, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Some ships report pressure of 29 inches. Others report 28.5. The data doesn't form a coherent picture. Halsey cancels the second rendezvous, orders a third. The fleet changes course again, due west now, attempting to outrun the storm by steaming at 3 to 6 knots faster than the estimated system movement. For a few hours, it works. Sea conditions improve marginally. Ships that were rolling 30 degrees settle to 20. Maybe, just maybe, they've threaded the needle. Officers in the Combat Information Center allow themselves cautious optimism. The latest reports show improving conditions. The pressure readings have stabilized. Perhaps the storm is moving away, tracking north as originally predicted. Perhaps they've escaped the worst of it. But by 2200 hours, it's clear they haven't. The swells are growing again. The wind is backing around to the northeast, an ominous sign that suggests the storm is wrapping around them, that they're being pulled into its circulation. Halsey cancels the third rendezvous point, designates a fourth, this time to the northwest. At 2300 hours, he orders the fleet to turn south, hoping to find the promised calm waters. It's a desperate gamble. The fleet is now zigging and zagging across the Philippine Sea like a drunken convoy, chasing ghost rendezvous points that dissolve into chaos before the ships can even reach them. Task Force 38 is spreading out, individual ships experiencing wildly different weather conditions depending on their position relative to the storm center. Some captains are reporting barometric pressure of 29 inches. Others are seeing 28. And aboard USS Dewey, the needle drops to 27.3, a reading so catastrophically low that it indicates the eye of a Category 5 typhoon is nearly on top of them. Yet the official typhoon warning doesn't come until 1345 the following day, December 18th. By then, 3 ships are already gone. The quiet before. 0200 hours, December 18th. The plan calls for the fleet to adjust course to the northwest, heading toward the 4th rendezvous point. But the seas won't allow it. Aboard the light carrier USS Langley, the flight deck is pitching at angles that defy physics. 30 degrees. 40 on one sickening roll. The deck tilts 70 degrees, so steep that men have to cling to stanchions to avoid sliding into the ocean. Aircraft that were chained down on the hangar deck begin to tear loose. Chains snap. Planes slide across the deck like children's toys, smashing into bulkheads, into each other. Fuel tanks rupturing, wings crumpling. The noise is apocalyptic. Metal screaming against metal. Fuel igniting in brief. Fierce explosions. Men shouting warnings that are swallowed by the wind. The carrier heels so far over that the ocean is visible through the hangar bay doors. Green water sloshing across the deck. Waves reaching up like fingers trying to pull the ship under. On USS Cowpens, 7 aircraft are simply washed overboard by waves that sweep across the flight deck. A 20-millimeter gun emplacement, 3 tons of steel bolted to the deck, is ripped from its mount by the wind and hurled into the catwalk below. A loose plane collides with others and ignites, flames licking up toward the wooden flight deck. Damage control teams scramble through waist-deep water, extinguishing the blaze before it can spread, before the entire carrier becomes a floating funeral pyre. The destroyers have it worse. With their fuel tanks nearly dry, they're riding so high that their propellers are breaking the surface with every wave. When the screws come out of the water, they spin uselessly, engines screaming, shafts vibrating at frequencies that threaten to tear the machinery apart. And when the bow digs into a trough, when 40-foot waves break over the foredeck, the ship doesn't rise. It plunges, burying itself in green water, the weight of the ocean pressing down like a fist. Ventilation fails. Blowers in the engine room shut down, and temperatures spike to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Men are evacuated from spaces that have become ovens, stumbling up ladders into passageways where the air is thick with fuel oil and vomit and terror. And still, the orders from New Jersey keep coming. At 0803, Halsey cancels the 4th rendezvous point, orders the fleet due south. One more course change, one more attempt to find safety. But by then, the ocean has already chosen its victims. The meteorological blindness. Here's what makes Typhoon Cobra so grimly fascinating. It was small. Most typhoons are sprawling giants, systems that span hundreds of miles, giving ships days of warning as pressure drops and winds build across vast distances. But Cobra was compact, intensely violent, and anomalously fast-moving. Its eye was only 15 miles wide. The zone of hurricane-force winds extended perhaps 50 miles from the center. For a naval task force spread across 100 square miles, this meant that individual ships could be experiencing completely different weather, some battling sustained winds of 100 knots while others, just 30 miles away, saw nothing worse than a bad squall. This made tracking the storm nearly impossible. Weather forecasters at Fleet Weather Central on Saipan had detected signs of a tropical disturbance on December 16th. They sent reconnaissance flights. They transmitted warnings. But their position estimates were off by hundreds of miles, and their projected path, north away from the fleet, was catastrophically wrong. The reconnaissance flights faced their own challenges. Flying into tropical storms with 1944 technology meant relying on visual observation and basic instruments. Pilots couldn't see through clouds. They couldn't measure wind speeds at different altitudes. They couldn't determine precise storm locations. They could only report what they observed directly, and those observations were often incomplete or misleading. By the time Halsey's horologist, Commander Kosko, realized the barometer was falling very, very rapidly in a manner consistent with an approaching typhoon, it was mid-morning on December 18th. By the time the official typhoon warning was issued at 13:45, several carriers had already spotted the eye of the storm on their primitive radar screens. The technology simply didn't exist to see Cobra coming. No satellites, no Doppler radar, no computer models, just barometers, visual observation, and the collective intuition of men who'd spent their lives at sea. And even that wasn't enough. The fury unleashed. December 18th, dawn. The ocean is no longer the blue expanse it was days before. Water twists and surges. Mountainous waves rise like walls, shrinking even the largest ships to specks. The wind shrieks with a violence that drowns not only voices, but reason itself. On the deck of the USS Hull, sailors clutch lifelines in the stinging spray. Steel groans beneath their boots. The ship tilts 40 degrees and more with every wave. One moment, the sky is blotted out by a wall of salt and foam. The next, the entire deck plunges toward a trough, so deep it feels like falling. Sheets of rain hammer the fleet. Visibility vanishes. The destroyers, their fuel tanks nearly dry, ride dangerously high and unstable, making them especially vulnerable as the storm gathers strength. Some captains radio frantic updates. Barometric pressure drops lower than any reading they've ever logged. The eye of the storm isn't approaching. It's swallowing them whole. Lieutenant Commander Marks on Hull makes a critical decision. He orders seawater ballasted into the empty fuel tanks, attempting to lower the ship's center of gravity, to add weight to the bottom of the hull. It's the right call, but it comes too late. The pumps struggle against the ship's violent motion. Water sloshes in the tanks, creating a free surface effect that actually decreases stability instead of improving it. The ship becomes even more unpredictable, rolling further with each successive wave. Aboard the USS Spence, chaos becomes normal. The ship lurches, spinning its screws helplessly in the air before slamming back into the water. Men scramble to secure loose ordnance. Below decks, temperatures soar as ventilation systems fail. Superheated air, thick with the smell of oil and fear, forces crews to abandon engine rooms and pray for survival. The engineering spaces become death traps. With ventilation shut down and the ship rolling wildly, temperatures climb past bearable limits. Men stagger topside, gasping, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their faces flushed with heat exhaustion. Behind them, the machinery spaces tick and groan, metal expanding in the heat, systems straining under loads they were never designed to withstand. Command in the eye. Inside the command center on the battleship New Jersey, Admiral Halsey stands rigid. The room is tense, meticulously organized, radios crackling with intermittent static. Orders fly. Change course, slow speed. Turn south. On the radar screen, patches of blinding noise are interpreted as squalls, until it becomes clear they are the swirling arms of a monster. A tragic irony settles over the flagship. Halsey, whose career was built on decisive action, now faces a foe untouchable by ordnance or strategy. Commands ripple outward through the fleet, but the Typhoon does not care for ranks or reputations. A new order, cancel the fourth refueling rendezvous and head due south, reverberates too late. The sea is already choosing its victims. Officers relay information. Weather forecasts are fragmented, arriving seconds apart, often outdated or incorrect. Pressure readings on the USS Dewey fall to record lows. Each ship fights its own battle, disconnected from the broader plan, insulated by walls of wind and sheets of water. Captain Kosko, the fleet horologist, realizes with dawning horror that they're not skirting the storm. They're inside it. The barometric readings, when plotted together, form a circular pattern with New Jersey positioned somewhere near the edge of the circulation. The storm is all around them. Every course change has brought them closer to the center instead of farther away. He brings his assessment to Halsey. The Admiral studies the charts, his expression unreadable. There's no good option left. They can't outrun the storm. It's moving too fast. They can't navigate around it. They're already enveloped. All they can do is issue warnings, order ships to take emergency measures, and hope that seamanship and luck will see them through. The ships break. Midday approaches. The USS hull becomes unmanageable. 90-degree rolls, bulkheads torn free, superstructure battered by waves taller than any destroyer. At the height of the storm, the destroyer USS Hull flips onto her side, plunging hundreds of men into the churning water. Within minutes, she disappears completely. The moment of capsizing is almost surreal. The ship rolls to port, past 40 degrees, past 60, past 80. For a brief moment, she hangs there, perpendicular to the water, her keel exposed to the screaming wind. Men on deck are thrown into the ocean. Men below scramble for hatches that are now sideways or upside down. Then gravity takes over. The ship completes the roll, goes inverted, and begins her final plunge into the depths. 62 men survive hull sinking. They cling to wreckage, life rafts, pieces of decking, anything that floats. The Typhoon rages around them. Waves 50 feet high toss them like debris. The water is warm, at least this is the tropics, but the violence of the seas makes survival a minute-by-minute struggle. Men lose their grip on rafts and vanish. Others are swept away by waves. Some simply give up, letting go, sinking into the gray-green depths. The USS Spence, capsized after uncontrollable rolls and taking on water through every seam, sinks before her crew can muster a proper evacuation. Dozens escape into the ocean, clinging to wreckage, battered by waves that threaten to tear their grip from existence. 24 men survive Spence. Among them is Ensign Joseph McCrane, who finds himself in the water with no life jacket, clinging to a floating piece of cork insulation. He will spend 3 days in the ocean before rescue, watching other survivors succumb to exhaustion, to hypothermia despite the warm water, to injuries sustained during the sinking. He will watch sharks circle. He will watch rescue planes fly overhead, unable to see the tiny figures bobbing in the vast Pacific. And he will survive to tell the story of how Typhoon Cobra swallowed his ship whole. The USS Monaghan meets the same fate, a final roll. Then the ship vanishes beneath the Typhoon's brute force. Hundreds are gone. Only a handful survive, plucked days later from the debris-strewn sea by rescuers who arrive after the skies clear. 6 men from Monaghan. 6 out of 262. They will drift for 3 days on a single life raft, taking turns holding onto the sides, rationing the small supply of emergency water, watching the horizon for rescue that seems like it will never come. Elsewhere on the carriers, aircraft snap their chains and tumble like dominoes across decks pitched 70 degrees skyward. Fires erupt when planes crash and fuel tanks burst, forcing frantic crews to race against disaster in conditions barely survivable. Scenes of survival and loss. Across the fleet, utter confusion reigns. Sailors are swept overboard. Some survive hours in the freezing water, defying logic and fate. The USS Tabor, battered afloat, defies her orders and begins a rescue operation, pulling 55 men from the sea over 3 agonizing days. Tabor's captain, Lieutenant Commander Henry Plage, makes a decision that will save dozens of lives and earn him a Legion of Merit. Instead of proceeding with the fleet after the storm passes, he turns his destroyer around and begins a methodical search pattern, looking for survivors. His crew spots floating heads in the water, tiny dots of humanity against the vast ocean. They maneuver the ship close, throw lines, pull exhausted men aboard. On the battleship North Carolina, even immune to capsizing by sheer mass, sections flood, and crew members are knocked off their feet as the ship rolls and pitches unpredictably. The USS Langley rolls at an impossible angle, nearly capsizing, while other carriers lose entire squadrons to the ocean as wind and water rip planes from their moorings. The cruiser Miami suffers a steering casualty and spins in circles for 30 minutes, completely out of control, her rudder jammed hard over, her crew fighting to regain directional control while waves hammer the ship from all directions. The cruiser Baltimore takes a wave over the bow so massive that it bends a forward gun turret, 50 tons of armored steel, upward by several degrees. The wave simply picked up the turret and twisted it like a toy. Up in the command, Halsey is forced to reckon with the bitter truth. The worst human error is not an individual mistake, but a chain of decisions, each shaped by pride, miscommunication, and technological limits. The realization dawns too late. The enemy on that day was illusion of control, tragic irony, and aftermath. By late afternoon, the Typhoon weakens and moves on. The silence is deafening. Halsey orders search parties for men lost to the waves. It is not until the next morning, when the survivors are counted, that the full horror surfaces. 3 destroyers missing, hundreds gone, dozens of ships crippled, scores of aircraft wrecked or lost. Nearly 800 lives lost, not to war, but to the ocean itself. The Navy's greatest natural disaster, recorded in stunned reports and sorrowful telegrams. The fleets limped toward Ulithi, stunned by the power of wind and water, haunted by the knowledge that catastrophic loss could come not from enemy fire, but from a perfect storm of human error and nature's indifference. The ultimate irony? The order to steer south, in search of calmer waters, led directly into the storm's heart. The silence that followed. December 19th, 0200 hours. The wind has died. The seas, though still restless, no longer tower above flight decks. Stars appear through breaking clouds, cold, indifferent pinpricks in a black sky. Across the Philippine Sea, the battered remnants of Task Force 38 limp toward Ulithi Atoll, counting their losses. It's in this eerie calm that Admiral Halsey learns the full cost of Typhoon Cobra. 3 destroyers, USS Hull, USS Spence, USS Monaghan, are simply gone. Not damaged, not crippled, vanished beneath the waves with nearly 800 souls aboard. The numbers arrive in terse radio messages. Hull lost 202 men, with only 62 pulled from the wreckage. Spence went down with 317 sailors. Just 24 survived. Monaghan suffered the worst. 256 presumed lost, only 6 rescued after drifting for 3 agonizing days on rafts. 790 men total, 80 more injured, 146 aircraft destroyed, more than some air battles claimed. 27 ships damaged, 11 requiring repairs so extensive they'd be out of action for months. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would later remark that the Typhoon represented a more crippling blow to the Third Fleet than it might be expected to suffer in anything less than a major action. The Japanese hadn't fired a shot. The ocean had done their work for them. The damage assessment takes days to compile. Ship after ship reports twisted steel, buckled decks, equipment torn from its mounts, flooding, electrical failures. The carrier Monterey reports a hangar deck fire that nearly destroyed the ship. Among the firefighters was a young lieutenant named Gerald Ford, who would later become President of the United States. The escort carrier Altamaha suffered such severe damage that she was nearly abandoned. The light carrier San Jacinto lost every aircraft on her flight deck. The public reckoning. On January 10th, 1945, the Navy Department released a terse statement to the press. The New York Times ran the headline, 3 U.S. destroyers lost in the Typhoon. The story was clinical, almost attached, noting that the ships were engaged in combat operations when they encountered a typhoon of considerable severity that formed very rapidly. The emphasis was carefully placed. Operational circumstances were so critical that the missions could not be halted or modified due to weather. It was a masterclass in wartime public relations. The losses were framed not as preventable tragedy, but as unavoidable sacrifice in the service of pressing military objectives. The truth, that the fleet had spent hours zigging and zagging across the ocean chasing phantom rendezvous points, that the meteorological data was catastrophically wrong, that the storm's compact size and erratic path had made tracking nearly impossible, was buried under euphemism and operational necessity. The press release emphasized the fleet's aggressive operations against Japanese positions, the successful support of MacArthur's invasion timetable, the destruction of enemy aircraft and facilities. The Typhoon was presented as an unfortunate natural event, a risk inherent to naval operations in the Pacific, an act of God rather than a failure of judgment or technology. Families received telegrams. Sailors were listed as missing or presumed lost. The war continued. Within weeks, the Third Fleet was back at sea, striking targets in support of the invasion of Luzon. The Typhoon became a footnote, Tragic, yes, but secondary to the larger narrative of American victory in the Pacific. But within the Navy, a different conversation was beginning: the Court of Inquiry. A formal court of inquiry convened to examine the loss of Hull, Spence, and Monaghan, and the extensive damage to other vessels. Officers testified. Weather charts were reviewed. Barometric logs were scrutinized. The question at the center of the proceedings was deceptively simple. Could this disaster have been avoided? The findings were complicated. The court determined that Admiral Halsey bore responsibility. His decisions to repeatedly change rendezvous points, to steer the fleet south into the storm's path, and to delay issuing a typhoon warning until 1345 on December 18th all contributed to the catastrophe. But the inquiry also acknowledged the context. Halsey was operating under the stress of war operations and stemming from a commendable desire to meet military requirements. His errors were deemed errors in judgment rather than negligence. The inquiry spent weeks analyzing the sequence of decisions. Each course change was examined. Each weather report was scrutinized. Each communication between ships was reviewed. The court heard testimony from surviving officers, from meteorologists, from deck officers who had watched the barometers fall and the seas rise. The captains of the 3 lost destroyers were also criticized. The court found they had waited too long in acting to prevent the foundering of their ships. Specifically, they failed to ballast their nearly empty fuel tanks quickly enough to stabilize the vessels in extreme seas. It was a harsh verdict for men who had perished with their crews, unable to defend their choices. This finding was particularly controversial. The destroyer captains had acted on the best information available to them, following fleet orders, trusting that higher command had assessed the weather situation accurately. To criticize them posthumously for not acting more aggressively seemed to many observers like blaming the victims, like scapegoating junior officers for systemic failures. What the inquiry couldn't fully capture was a cascade effect. The way each decision, reasonable in isolation, compounded into disaster when combined. The fuel shortage that left destroyers top-heavy. The meteorological blindness of 1944 technology. The pressure to maintain operational tempo. The compact, fast-moving nature of Typhoon Cobra itself, which defied prediction and evaded detection until it was too late. Halsey retained his command. He would go on to accept the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. But Typhoon Cobra followed him, a reminder that the ocean answers to no admiral, no matter how decorated. The cost of certainty. Here's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Nobody involved was stupid. Nobody was recklessly incompetent. Halsey was a brilliant tactician who had won critical battles. His meteorologists were working with the best tools available. The destroyer captains were experienced sailors. And yet, 790 men died. The tragedy of Typhoon Cobra isn't that it was caused by villains. It's that it was caused by momentum, the inertia of a war machine that couldn't easily stop, even when warning signs appeared. Refueling was critical. The mission timeline was tight. Barometric readings were concerning, but not yet catastrophic. Each choice made sense in the moment. Each course correction seemed justified, until the ocean proved otherwise. This is a paradox of command in wartime. The pressure to act decisively can make hesitation seem like weakness, even when caution might save lives. Halsey's reputation was built on aggression, on pressing the attack, on refusing to yield. Those qualities won battles. But against the Typhoon, they became liabilities. The psychological pressure on commanders in wartime cannot be overstated. Halsey knew that MacArthur was waiting for air support. He knew that Japanese forces were regrouping. He knew that delays could cost American lives when the invasion began. Against those pressures, against that context, the weather warnings seemed manageable, seemed like obstacles to overcome rather than signs to heed. The legacy of Typhoon Cobra extended far beyond December 1944. The Navy overhauled its meteorological training, invested in better forecasting technology, and implemented stricter protocols for severe weather. Future commanders studied Halsey's decisions as a case study in the limits of human judgment under pressure. The disaster became a teaching moment, proof that even the mightiest fleet is vulnerable when nature, hubris, and circumstance align. Weather training became mandatory for all ship captains. New procedures were established for ballasting destroyers in heavy seas. Communication protocols were improved to ensure that weather information from individual ships reached Fleet Command more quickly. The Navy established a Joint Typhoon Warning Center, dedicated specifically to tracking tropical storms in the Pacific. The Forgotten Graves. Somewhere beneath the Philippine Sea, the wrecks of Hull, Spence, and Monaghan rest in darkness. No markers. No memorials. Just steel tombs holding the remains of men who fought their final battle, not against an enemy, but against wind and water. Their families grieve in the winter of 1945, holding memorial services with empty caskets. The survivors, those handful who clung to wreckage and were plucked from the waves by the heroic crew of USS Tabor, carried the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. They spoke of waves like mountains, of ships rolling past 70 degrees and never coming back, of the moment when lights went out, when engines died, when gravity itself seemed to betray them. The survivors' accounts are haunting. They described the moment of capsizing with clinical precision, the angle of the deck, the sound of bulkheads giving way, the rush of water through rupture hatches. They described floating in the typhoon-tossed seas, watching their ships disappear, wondering if rescue would ever come. They described the guilt of survival, the question that haunted them for decades. Why did I live when so many others died? The irony, the cruel irony, is that these sailors survived Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, the battles that defined the Pacific War, only to be claimed by a storm that formed in a matter of hours and dissolved just as quickly. War teaches many lessons. But Typhoon Cobra taught one that transcends strategy and tactics: humility, the acknowledgement that control is often an illusion, that certainty can be the most dangerous delusion, that sometimes the bravest choice is to stop, to wait, to let the storm pass, even when every instinct screams to press forward. The archives remember. History is filled with moments like this. Not grand betrayals or villainous schemes, but cascades of human error, pressure, and circumstance that collide with disastrous results. The archives hold these stories, declassified reports, survivor testimonies, weather logs that went unheeded. They're uncomfortable reminders that tragedy doesn't always announce itself with clear warnings. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's written in fallen barometers and fragmentary radio signals. If you found yourself thinking about the choices you'd make in Halsey's position, about the way to command, about the thin line between heroism and hubris, then you understand why these stories matter. They're not just history. They're warnings, lessons that echo across decades, waiting for anyone willing to listen. Join us by subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next investigation, because the forgotten disasters, the buried mistakes, the moments when certainty collided with chaos, they deserve to be remembered, not to mock the fallen, but to honor them by learning what they paid so dearly to teach us. The Pacific Ocean doesn't negotiate, and it never forgets.